Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be changing things up a bit, and instead of looking at an altcoin, we're going to be looking at Intel, a tech stock that has become notorious in the last few months for its poor price action and the controversies that caused that. If you like this switch up in content, be sure to leave a like so I know to make more of it. Anyway, getting straight in, we can see that if we look at Intel, from the start of this year, Intel has just collapsed from a high of about $50 opening the year back in January, all the way down to a local low, the current price that we're currently at, about $20, but all the way down to 19. And we can see that this isn't the first major long-term correction Intel has seen in recent history. With the 2023 AI narrative exploding, Intel, of course, as a tech stock, saw a good rally from a low of 25 all the way up to that $50 that we spoke about. But previous to that, it had been trading down from a high of $70. And to emphasize how poorly Intel has actually been doing, if we draw a line from the current price, we can see that if you bought Intel stock anytime after January 2013, and you held that Intel stock up to today, you are in the red. So for holding a stock over a decade, you've actually lost money, which is of course terrible news. Now, just from a TA standpoint, if you zoom out, we can see that this isn't the first time Intel has had a volatile few years. We can see back in 1999, it rocketed up from these lows of $20 all the way up to its all-time high of $75, for it then only to return down even lower than where it started in 2003 to a price of $15. And I think it's worth examining this move and comparing it to what we've seen in recent history and see if we can draw any resemblances. And funnily enough, we actually can. So we saw that from this high of $75 all the way down to the local low where Intel actually saw some kind of meaningful reversion, it dropped 75%. And now from the high that we've recently experienced down to a low where we found a bit of a correction, or at least a reversion, we can see we dropped 65%. Now those are similar percents, but they're not exact. However, if we check where Intel fell, or how far Intel fell after that reversion, so it found its support and bounced up, if we take that high to the next low, we can see it fell 62%, which is pretty similar to what we saw here, a 64% drop. Also, if we take a look at how high Intel rallied from this low, we can see this cycle, this recent history here. Back in 2023, Intel rallied 100%, basically a 2x from its price from the lows of $25 all the way up to $50. Back in 2001, we can see that it actually did a pretty similar move. From these lows of about $20, it rallied up to a high of about $37. So there is a small case to be made that potentially we have these two moves here, this first move down and this second move down, simply swapped around. Funnily enough, if we actually check the worst month that Intel had during 2022, it had a monthly drop back in June of 33%. We can see here from open to close of 35%. Now, if we take a look at recently, what we've done this month in August, if I finally ever get there, we can see that the drop that we've actually made recently from current open to close is 33% bang on as well. Now, as of recording, there's 2 days left of August. I can't see anything happening over the next day and a half that changes this percentage dramatically in any way at all. Maybe we move down to 34%, maybe we move up to 32%, but all in all, it's basically the same move that we have seen. So to summarize what I've just basically gone over, we've seen that from the previous high that Intel put in, it went down for a prolonged period of time, had a short revival, but then ultimately went down even further. What we've seen recently is Intel has come down for a prolonged period of time, it's had a recovery, and then it's ultimately come down even further. Now, in my opinion, I still think the knife is falling. The high that we're trading down from isn't even the all-time high. It didn't manage to break above its 2000 highs. So I expect we could see the price do even worse over the next few months and potentially years. If you look at the actual health of the company, you can see that Intel has made some very bad choices in terms of taking on debt, in terms of operational margins, very recently let off a huge amount of its workforce. There's a lot of things here that suggest that there's more trouble down the road. And if we have got these moves switched up here, we could potentially be looking at a 74% drop from the local high that we put in back in December of 2023, and that would bring us down all the way to $15. Now, there is a case to be made that we could fall as low as $10, and that's simply because over the last 20 years, as we can see, the long-term trend for Intel has been down. This resistance has forced the long-term highs down, and this support has left space for the lows to go even lower. So if we are going to return to this support, and if we do it in, say, the space of a year, in August or October time of 2025, we could be looking at a $10 Intel. And that's assuming that things just don't get better. And from what we've seen, when Intel has dramatic drops, that is often the case. Now, another interesting point with Intel is if we take a look at basis points, if I turn on my basis points here, this is American interest rates, we can see that the last time Intel was at its all-time high, rates were high. But the funny thing is, Intel started crashing well before the Fed announced its first rate cut. And we can see that when the Fed did announce the first rate cut, Intel had already dropped 50%. It'd gone down to a price of $37 from a high of $75. And Intel had actually bottomed out well in advance of the final rate cut. We can see it was actually 2 rate cuts in advance that Intel bottomed out down here. And when interest rates were kept low, Intel rallied. But note, the majority of the damage was done before and just after the first interest rate cut. Intel went down to $26 and even down to lows of $22 before the second rate cut. If we compare that to what's happened recently, we can see that Intel did well when rates were being increased, like we saw here. Intel was rallying while rates were being increased, and we actually saw that here again as well, where rates were being increased and Intel started to rally up. But then as soon as we got the plateau, as soon as we stopped increasing and the Fed just held, that's when Intel struggled. And then when we had rate cuts as well, that's also when Intel has historically really struggled. Now again, note here that most of the damage was done before the first American rate cut came. What we've seen so far is a drop from the high to current prices of about 60%. That's pretty similar to the 50% that we saw here before we even got a rate cut. And now most people are pricing in a September rate cut for America. It's almost a foregone conclusion at this point. From the first rate cut to the low, Intel dropped approximately 50% again. So it was minus 54% here. So it was 50% before the first rate cut, 50% after the first rate cut to the low, to the bottom. If we're assuming that we're going to get something similar this time, we've had 50% before our first rate cut, and we could potentially be getting a rate cut in the next few days. If we take another 50% drop from where we are, that brings us down to, would you believe, this support line that has been slowly trending down over the last 2 decades. Now, a key difference here that you can argue is that last time, back in the 2000s, it took Intel 25 months to move from this high to that low. And you can argue that the low actually came much later on, back in 2009, but that was unrelated to the move that went on over in the early 2000s. We are currently, from the high, have gone on 40 months to where we currently are, and assuming that Intel's going to continue to go down, we're obviously looking at more than 40 months. If, however, you want to move the goalposts a little bit, and you want to measure from the reversion high that we got after coming to this low, we bounced up, and measure from this high, we drag this across, and you can see that we're actually at 8 months. So we are coming up close to our low if we're going to follow this time frame, which of course there's no guarantee that we will do, but it could indicate that there might not be much longer before we get some kind of bottoming out. Now, the question that obviously comes to mind is it worth it? Is it worth picking up Intel now at this price? And I'm afraid I cannot answer that for you, but I can answer it for myself. And for me personally, I would say no. And that's simply because, more or less for the last 2 decades, Intel hasn't really done much. I mean, we saw most stocks absolutely explode during COVID, especially tech stocks, but that just didn't happen for Intel, which in my opinion was a bad sign. The company, as well itself, disregarding the charts, has made some very poor decisions, especially when it comes to the dividend of the stock and the recent controversies with their chips. AMD is slowly taking market share from them. They don't have any AI narrative or interest. There's just nothing special about Intel. And another thing I want to show you very quickly as well is the Nasdaq. If you take a look at the Nasdaq, which is what you're looking at right now, if you bought any time before August of 2016 and you held until today, you are 350% in the profit. And that's to current prices. Or sorry, it's to the highs of 20,000. If you bought the Nasdaq any time basically before 1999, you've only been in profit. And over the last 8 years, I will of course remind you, like I just said, you've gone up 350%. That's basically 50% a year. And that's including having strong pull downs, big corrections. So when I ask myself, is Intel worth it? Potentially, if I buy now and hold 5 or 6 years, I could be looking at a tidy profit. Or I could just hold the Nasdaq. I could buy the Nasdaq at all-time highs and I can rest pretty easy knowing that unless something terribly globally happens, I'm going to be in profit in the medium and long-term future. And if, again, you want to compare the last 8 years, Intel's done well, but it wouldn't have been considered as safe as a bet compared to the Nasdaq. And it also wouldn't have made you as much money even if you timed it perfectly. You wouldn't even have made half the money you would have holding the Nasdaq. And in fact, if you gave Intel its best run and you take it from these lows of $17 and bring it to its all-time high of 75, it's still below what the Nasdaq did over the 7-8 years from 2016, from that low to that high. So for me, Intel is just not worth it. So even though we have seen a big correction and there's a good chance that in the near future, Intel will see some kind of reversion and we will see a couple of green candles, you really have to ask yourself, are those green candles worth it? I'm taking on extra risk when historically it's performed much worse than a blue chip asset. It's performed worse than the Nasdaq 100. Even during its best times, the Nasdaq has still outperformed Intel. So why would I take that risk? Why would I take on more risk for less reward? It doesn't make sense. And again, if you time it perfectly with Intel, let's say you buy at this kind of $10 range and it rallies back up to the all-time highs, then potentially you're making money. But realistically, if we really drag these lines out, because that's what we're going to be looking at here, it's basically every 20 years that Intel tags this resistance. So if you want to move another 20 years out to 2024, we can see the high then would be about $60. So if you do buy at this low of $10 and manage to sell perfectly at the high, when it tags again, you're looking at 5xing your money over a 20-year period. And that's if you do it perfectly, which of course you're not going to do. And that's also if this scenario even plays out, which to be honest with you is pretty unlikely. However, if you take the Nasdaq for a 20-year time frame, we can even time it pretty poorly. We'll get it from the very top here at 4,000. If you want to time that perfectly, you're still making less, but the risk is so much lower. And if you want to time it perfectly, you can see that you make over four times what you would with Intel. So for me, definitely not worth it. I think I've made my point clear, guys. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike too. That is totally fine. If you want me to cover more stocks in the future, not just crypto, please comment it down below. This is a bit of an experiment, so depending on the feedback I get on this video will dictate whether we do more videos like this. Anyway, thanks so much, guys. Take care and peace.